Have you heard of Ur of the Chaldees? It's mentioned 4 times in the Bible. But Ur was lost and forgotten, and scholars deny that it ever existed. Now, through the work of archaeologists, we know that it was in fact a very important city of the ancient world. In this program, David will be telling us about its discovery in recent times.
Have you ever heard of Ur of the Chaldees? Well, if you've read your Bible, you should have, because it's mentioned 4 times in the biblical record, although actually each of those 4 times virtually says the same thing. I'll read you, for instance, what it says in Genesis chapter 11 and in verse 31, where it says, "And Terah took his son Abraham and his grandson Lot, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go to the land of Canaan." So in other words, the only reference to Ur of the Chaldees is the reference to Abraham leaving his home place there and going to the land of Canaan. Now, there are no historical records about Ur of the Chaldees. And so, apart from the Bible, there's no mention of it. And so guess what the critics said? Oh, well, they said Ur of the Chaldees, just a figment of the Bible writer's imagination, just a legend. Or if it was actually a place, just some obscure little village in Mesopotamia, we don't know where it was. And so they just wrote it off as a Bible blunder. Now I'd like you to come with me to southern Iraq, to a site called Tel El Makaya. And here we find a ziggurat, or temple tower, and it literally means in Arabic, mound of pitch. Now it is called this because all the bricks of this ziggurat are stuck together with bitumen or pitch, and so they call it Tel El Makaya, mound of pitch. Well, it was in 1854 that the British Museum sent a message to the British consul in Mosul. You see, Layard had dug up so many winged bulls in Assyria and sent them back to the British Museum, and the British public were hungry for more. And so the museum sent a message to its consul there saying, "Hey, old boy, see if you can get us some more stuff to put in the museum, will you?" And so Taylor, seeing in this an opportunity for a little diversion for him from his boring consular activities, readily agreed. He rounded up some Arab workmen, got some donkeys and picks and shovels and all the rest of it, and away they went to Tel El Makaya. Well, when Taylor got there, he saw this big ziggurat, you know, and he thought, now this must be some fabulous treasures inside this. So he walked all round it, tapping on the sides, hoping to find some hollow sound which would betray a room or some place inside where there could be stored some valuables. But that temple tower or ziggurat was just as solid as the Rock of Gibraltar, and there was no echo from within. Well, Taylor was undaunted. He took his men up to the top of the tower and started savagely attacking it with his picks and shovels, throwing all the bricks down onto the ground below, and hoping to come down to some place where he would find something valuable. They did an enormous amount of damage, which makes the archaeologists shudder these days, but those were the days before archaeology really was born, and so Taylor had no experience whatsoever. And he just kept on digging down, 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 and he virtually found nothing. At last he gave up in disgust. All he had found were 4 clay cylinders inscribed with cuneiform writing, which he sent back to the British Museum with a sort of an apology. "Sorry, old chaps, this is all I could find." Well, the British Museum, that was used to getting these winged bulls from Layard, was pretty disgusted. But they put these cylinders into a back room and left them there and really forgot about them. Little did they realise what a fabulous treasure they had. Well, about 20 years went by, and in the meantime, the cuneiform script became understandable. Sir Henry Rawlinson had cracked it open as a result of his study on the Behistun or Bisatoon rock, and now people could read and understand the cuneiform. And so it occurred to somebody to get out these cylinders that Taylor had sent back and find out just what was written there. They discovered that it was a dedicatory cylinder in which the builder of the ziggurat, or the rebuilder of it, mentioned that he had done this reconstruction work. And it mentioned that his name was Ur-Nammu. Ur-Nammu? Could it be that this was King Nammu and he was the king of the city of Ur? Yes, indeed it was. And so it was identified as Ur of the Chaldees. That was a bit of a shock, of course, to the critics, and they had to take a back seat then. And so now Ur of the Chaldees was definitely identified as a geographical locality, and obviously a very important one too. In 1918, the British Army was driving the Turks out of Iraq, and they were moving up from the Persian Gulf, and they came to Ur of the Chaldees, or Tel el-Makaya. Now it so happened that there was a certain officer in the British Army by the name of Major Thompson, and as he galloped by this spectacular ziggurat, he was very impressed. And as opportunity permitted, he did a little scratching around there, because it so happened he'd been employed by the British Museum, you see, and that was before his military days. And so he did a little scratching around, and he sent a message back to the British Museum saying that here is a site that would be worth excavating. The British Museum got the message, and sometime later it did send an expedition out to do a little investigating. They came back with a good report, and in 1922 a large-scale expedition was mounted with Sir Leonard Woolley as its director. And Leonard Woolley made it his virtual life work, working there from 1922 to 1934 on these excavations, and he made some spectacular discoveries. He didn't pay much attention to the ziggurat. He did excavate the temple area around this ziggurat, and in particular he discovered what are known as the death pits of Ur. He found that these early kings had been buried in brick vaults, and outside of these vaults there was a pit, and into this pit marched down a whole assembly of courtiers and servants and musicians and bullock drivers and all the rest of it. Anything up to 80 people moved into one of these pits. And then when the set time was come and already everyone was all set around, they drank a cupful of poison and lay down and died. Woolley even found the bowl that contained the poison and the cups from which they drank. And it seems to have been quite a voluntary affair. In other words, these people were voluntarily choosing to go into the afterlife with their departed king. At least they had the courage of their beliefs, you know, in the afterlife. And that's more than a lot of people have today. And so these death pits proved to be very spectacular. There were some remarkable things found inside the tombs of the kings. For instance, there was the beautiful golden, or it was a gold and silver helmet of Meshkalem Dag. There was the headdress of Queen Shubad, beautiful things, gold leaf, delicately, exquisitely done, and they're in the museum today. And then there were pendants and jewels and all types of beautiful ornaments. Many rich treasures came out of these tombs of Ur of the Chaldees. And so it was realized that Ur of the Chaldees was not just some obscure village in Mesopotamia, but was actually the center of a very prosperous and important civilization. In fact, it was a civilization that nobody knew existed, the Sumerians. Now we know, of course, that the Sumerians were the world's first civilization. Yes, before Egypt, before Assyria, before the Hittites, the Sumerians were the people, for instance, who first learned to write cuneiform in script. They were the people who learned to work out the area of a triangle. They were the people who understood the formula 2 pi r. It was an incredibly advanced civilization. And so Abraham, instead of coming from some village in Iraq, actually came from a wealthy and well-educated society, and undoubtedly Abraham himself was a well-educated, intelligent and affluent person with a large following. One of the best known items that Woolley found in Ur of the Chaldees was this here, which is known as the Royal Standard of Ur. It is made of stone, beautiful blue stone, with ivory inlay. On this side it shows a domestic scene, on the other side it shows a military scene. And this gives us a very good idea of the type of people, the type of vehicles, the type of dress that existed in Ur in ancient times. It was carried as a standard, probably into battle, you know, on the end of a pole. So it is known as the Royal Standard of Ur. Now, I suppose you've all got a dictionary at home, have you? An Oxford dictionary or a Webster on the shelves of your bookcase. Now, just in case you think that a dictionary is a modern invention, forget about it. The Sumerians had it thousands of years ago. Look, here is a clay tablet, and you'll notice it's in columns. One column gives you the Sumerian word, and in an adjacent column it gives you the Assyrian word. You've got the definitions there, you see, just like you would have in your Oxford dictionary. And they also had this king list, rather an interesting one. It's triangular, you see, and it was on clay. This is an exact replica, and rather interesting actually. The periods of reign for these kings are actually in thousands of years. Now, of course, we can't accept that each king reigned for 1,000 years, but it does indicate that those early people did live a long time. You know, you read the record in the Bible and you think, oh boy, surely they couldn't have lived that long. Well, here is a list that gives very extended periods, too far really, but it does show that they understood that people back there lived a very long time. Today we are in Hebron, and the building behind me here is a mosque that is built over the site of the burial place of Abraham and his family. You see, Abraham was a nomad, and he didn't have any possessions in this land. And so when Sarah, his wife, died, he had to arrange somewhere for her to be buried. And he purchased a plot from Ephron the Hittite. They did a bit of bargaining over it, and finally he purchased this cave and buried Sarah there. Later on he himself was buried here, and other members of his family such as Rebecca, Isaac. Actually you can't see their graves. The only way to get down into the cave is through an opening in the floor, and underneath there is where the tomb is. Now, nobody has ever been down there, nobody of archaeological ability anyway, so really don't know just what is down there, but this is where undoubtedly Abraham was buried. Well, Abraham spent quite a lot of his life here in Hebron and its environs, and it was while he was here that rather a dramatic incident took place. Abraham's nephew Lot lived away over there in the Jordan Valley at a place called Sodom. And while he was there was an invasion from Mesopotamia of 5 of their kings. And they captured Sodom and took Lot and his family and made off with them, together, of course, with all the booty from the city. Well, Abraham felt obliged to do something about this, and so he mustered his forces. He was quite a wealthy man, you know, and he had quite a lot of people attached to his household, and he marched down there and he followed them up, and he took these kings and their armies by surprise, defeated them, and brought Lot and his family back, together, of course, with all the other things that this invading army had taken. Well, naturally, the local inhabitants were very grateful for this, and it tells us in Genesis chapter 15 and in verse 18, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High, and he blessed him. That is, Melchizedek blessed Abraham. And then it goes on to say, and he, that is Abraham, gave him a tithe of all. Now the word tithe means tenth. And so Abraham gave Melchizedek a tenth of all he had acquired. Now that's a lot, isn't it? You know? And yet I think it's the secret of Abraham's prosperity, this practice of paying a tithe. You know, there's some people think that the secret of prosperity is to hold on to every cent you've got. Don't let it slip through your fingers. And the idea of giving a tenth of your income to God, that's just not on. But that's what Abraham did. And I think that was the secret of his prosperity. It says over here in the book of Proverbs, and in chapter 3 and verse 9, "Honor the Lord with your possessions, and with the first fruits of all your increase. So your barns will be filled with plenty." And so that's what Abraham did, and he prospered. Well, now that doesn't mean, of course, that if you give a tenth of all your income to the church, that immediately you're going to become a millionaire overnight. But I'll tell you this, if you have faith that could move mountains, and all you're doing is putting 20 cents in the offering plate occasionally when you go to church, I'll tell you, you can't expect much of God's blessing. It's got to be shown in a practical way. That is what Abraham did, and I think that was the secret of his prosperity. Abraham's grandson, Jacob, also paid tithe, you know. You've probably read the story, how he deceived his brother Esau, and Esau was determined to kill him. And so Jacob decided it would be healthiest if he left home. And so he came to what the Bible describes as the city of Luz, later known as Bethel. Well, we're in Bethel now, or rather the town of Bethel is over there, and this is just outside the town, and it was somewhere here that he lay down to sleep. And the Bible says that he had a stone for a pillow. Well, I don't know which stone he used for his pillow. I'm quite sure he didn't need a stone as big as any of these here. You might think, well, I wouldn't like a stone for a pillow. I'd rather have a feather pillow or something like that. But it was common practice in those days. For instance, Tutankhamun had a stone pillow. I don't know whether you've ever noticed that among his treasures. And he had all the money in the world. So that night, Jacob slept well, but he was troubled. He was heartsick and weary at having to run away from home, and also feeling of guilt for what he'd done. But as he slept, he had a dream, and the Bible says he saw a ladder set up to heaven. Now it's interesting, that word that is translated ladder there is the very word that was used during the time of his grandfather Abraham in Ur of the Chaldees for the steps of the ziggurat. Now these ziggurats were supposed to be steps up to heaven. And here were steps which just didn't reach a temple on top, they reached all the way to heaven. And Jacob saw the angels of God ascending and descending on these steps. And when he awakened in the morning, he was so thrilled to know that he was not rejected by God just because he'd done something wrong. God had accepted his repentance and sorrow for his sin, and so he had this dream. And Jacob was so pleased when he wakened up that he changed the name of this location from Luz to Bethel, meaning house of God. He said, surely I didn't realize it. God is in this place. And then he made a promise to God. You'll find it in Genesis chapter 28 and in verse 20, where it says, "Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and keep me in this way that I'm going, so that I come back to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and of all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you." Now, don't get the idea that Jacob was driving a bargain with God. He wasn't saying, well, listen, if you do this, I'll do this. He was simply saying, well, how good God is, and if he brings me back to my father's house so that I can pay my tithe, I will surely give a tenth to God. And I'm sure he kept that pledge too. Well, how does this tithing system work? How do you go about it? How do you calculate it? We're given the clue in the book of Leviticus chapter 27 and verse 30, where it says, "And all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. It is holy to the Lord." So that means the people who are on farms growing wheat, a tenth of all they reap, every 10th bag, belongs to God. It's his. And the same with the people who are looking after sheep. It says, "And concerning the tithe of the herd, of the flock, or whatever passes under the rod, the 10th shall be holy to the Lord." So every 10th baby lamb, every 10th baby calf that is born, it all belongs to God. And so the people who are in agriculture, that's the way they'd calculate it. Now, of course, you're probably earning a wage. You're probably getting a weekly or a monthly salary. Well, the same principle applies. When you get your pay packet, just figure out what a tenth is going to amount to, and that belongs to God. Well, now, what do you do with it? Do you use it for helping the poor or building a church or something else like that? No. Again, we're given specific instructions. It says, "Behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tithes in Israel as an inheritance in return for the work which they perform," the work of the tabernacle of the meeting. So in Israel's day, the people were to give their tithes to the Levites for the work that they did. Now, does this apply to the Christian dispensation? I believe so, because in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and in verse 13 it says, "Do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple?" That's referring to the Levitical priesthood. "Even so, or in like manner, has the Lord commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel." So just the same as the Levitical priests were supported by the tithe, so the gospel minister was to be supported by the tithe too. Well, is this obligatory? One day Jesus was teaching in the temple, and the Pharisees arrived again, and they came with another of their hard questions. One of these loaded questions, you know, whichever way you go, you're going to be wrong. That's what they thought anyway. And they said, "Good master, we know that you teach the truth, and we know that you're not afraid of any man. Tell us, should we pay tribute to Caesar or not?" Now, they thought they had him cornered again, you see, because if he says, "Yes, you should pay your tribute to Caesar," they would have gone running off to the people and say, "There you are, you see, he's teaching submission to these hated Romans." And of course, paying taxes back there was no more popular than paying taxes today. On the other hand, if Jesus said, "No, you should not pay tribute to Rome," they would have immediately gone running off to the Roman authorities and say, "Hey, this fellow is teaching people not to pay their taxes." And the government wouldn't react any more favourably back there than they would today if somebody taught people not to pay their taxes. So they thought they had him cornered. But Jesus came up with the right answer. He said, "Show me a penny." Now that word penny should be translated denarius, which was a common Roman coin in Jesus' day. A few years ago, I purchased a denarius. Cost me $100 way back there. It's worth a lot more today. It's a genuine coin. It has the head of Tiberius Caesar, and it has his inscription under it. Now, Tiberius Caesar was the Roman emperor at the time of Jesus. So this is a genuine coin, and I'm not going to claim it's the very coin that Jesus used, but it was certainly from his time, you see. And so Jesus held up the coin and he said, "Whose image," that is head, "and superscription," that is the inscription round it, "is this?" And of course they had to say, "It's Caesar's." "All right," he said, "render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." In other words, you should pay your taxes. I hope none of you are trying to avoid paying an honest tax. On the other hand, Jesus says, you should give to God the things that belong to him. Well, what belongs to him? Well, of course, everything in the world belongs to God. But in particular, he claims a tithe, a tenth of all our income belongs to God. And he says, render therefore to God the things that are God's. Now, of course, the first reaction of most people who first hear about tithing is 1/10. I just couldn't afford to pay so much. But my answer to that would be, when you hear what the Bible says about it, I think you'll agree that you just can't afford not to pay your tithe. Listen what it says in Malachi chapter 3 and in verse 8. "Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me. But you say, in what way have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings." You see, God says the tithe belongs to him. It doesn't belong to us. So if you use it for your own purposes, you are robbing God. That's not good, is it? So he says, bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and prove me now in this. Just try it out. Put it to the test, God says. And if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you such a blessing that there will not be room enough to receive it, you can't afford to be without a blessing like that, can you? He even says, and I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, so that he will not destroy the fruit of your ground. You know, all those grubs and caterpillars and rats and mice and so forth. God says he'll look after you, and that's worth having, isn't it? Now, I want to say a few words to a friend of mine, Arthur Schofield, who is an orange farmer, and he pays his tithe. Arthur, you seem to have a lot of trees here. Ever counted them up?
Well, they'd be between 7,000 and 8,000, David.
That's a lot of trees. I wouldn't like to have to pick all those oranges. How long have you been paying tithe, Arthur?
It's over 50 years now, David.
50 years, a long time, Arthur. I guess in that time you've paid a lot of money in tithe. How do you feel about this?
Well, now you've brought it up, we have paid a lot of money over that time, but feel very happy about it, David, to be in the tithing scheme. This has always been the Lord's way of supporting the ministry and getting the gospel to the world, and I'm sure happy to be one that supports it.
Do you feel any benefit from it yourself, spiritually, for instance?
Well, yes, every time I pay it. It reminds me that God owns everything, myself included, and it reminds me that, and keeps me from being selfish, that I'm just a steward of His.
That's a good point. Tell me, how do you get off financially? Do you feel it's you're worse off financially as a result of paying tithe?
The 9/10 with God's blessing is much better than the 10/10. We've done better and regarded along the Hawkesbury River here as more progressive than any of the other orchardists, and surely that must speak volumes.
Rod Adams is a wage earner with a wife and 2 children, and I asked him how long he had been paying tithe.
We would have been paying tithe around 15 years now.
That's a long time. You've got a wife and 2 children to support. I guess you're trying to pay off your home. Do you feel that paying 1/10 of your income is putting you back, you know? Has it made it hard for you?
We feel that it has been far better in the last 15 years than previously. Putting your trust in God has been more beneficial in many ways. And today's life is full of perplexities and worries, and by putting God first in tithing and putting Him as the highest priority, we've been able to ride out those difficult spots.
So you've been able to manage financially, eh?
Yes. Not our own doing. It's our ways haven't been often God's ways, but we have, even in the difficult times, been able to, the Lord has shown us a way around, not always given us money, but there's always been a solution to that very perplexing problem, and we feel that the peace of mind of knowing that we can trust in God has been worth more than any tithe paying or any donation we've ever made.
I'm talking to Ray Anderson, who is a retired businessman. Ray, you look a bit young to be retired. How come you retired so early?
Well, it's interesting that you ask a question like that. I suppose my wife asks me that every morning. But I think the cemetery is full of people who have tried just to make that little extra, and they've worked and worked till the last minute, and I thought that my philosophy in life is that perhaps if I can enjoy, while I have good health, good strength, enjoy the latter years of my life, then I think it may be all worthwhile. So I thought that maybe I'd make an early start.
What do you do with your time?
Well, I made a vow years ago that if the Lord blessed me and helped me to become financially secure, that I would devote the latter part of my life in helping his church, helping his people, and generally working to make others happy. And I find that by doing that I make myself happy and my life is much fuller as a result.
Very worthwhile too. Ray, did you always have your own business? You know, were you born with a silver spoon in your mouth?
Well, it's a long story, but actually it's far from that, because you've heard of people say when they come back from their honeymoon they have nothing. When I came back from my honeymoon I was in debt. And I got married a little later than the average. I was married at 28 years of age, and I retired at 54. So during that 26-year period, I basically went from being in debt to being at a stage where I can just live off the interest of the money that I've invested. So
But in your early years, did you, what sort of thing, you know, what were you doing?
I suppose it'd be easy to tell you what I didn't do.
You tried everything.
I tried everything. I had a car cleaning run. I cleaned windows. I sold health foods from door to door. I sold life assurance. I parked cars up behind the Chevron Hilton there at King's Cross up until 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning.
So you worked pretty hard on it?
Exceptionally hard. My wife took in ironing. We had a go at everything. Then gradually I worked up into having a health food store, and then I bought a nursing home. I had several of those, and I suppose it was there that I saw what the ultimate end of mankind was, as I saw people lying in the nursing home, and I thought, well, perhaps I ought to get my values straight, you know. And
now, over the years, I guess you've made quite a lot of money. That means if you've had paid tithe on that money, you've paid an awful lot of money into the church or into God's work, whatever it is. How do you feel about parting with all this money?
well, whose money is it to start with? Where did I get my health and my strength from, and my ideas and my incentive and my initiative and all of these things? I've been in several partnerships. Some have been very good, some have been very bad. But I've never been in a partnership where a person is going to give me all of these things, and in return all he wants is 1/10, and it's his anyway. So I figure this is a pretty good partnership, and I'm quite happy to give back 1/10. I don't care what the figure is, because I've got 9/10, and I find that if I invest and use that, that'll do me plenty.
Our next program will have some surprises for you, I think. The Bible contains so many records of prophets having dreams and visions from God, but have you ever wondered why there are no prophets today? In our next program, we visit ancient Corinth, where St. Paul has so much to say on this particular topic.